What if you discovered that your daughter-in-law was secretly mocking you online, calling you lazy and worthless, while you were actually working behind the scenes to save her entire family from financial ruin? And what if the revenge you planned wasn't about cruelty, but about teaching the most devastating lesson she would ever learn? And before I tell you how a 72-year-old grandmother turned the tables on the woman who humiliated her in front of millions of people, you need to subscribe to this channel right now, because this story isn't just about revenge. It's about dignity, respect, and the moment when someone who thought you were weak shows them exactly what power looks like. So hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because what happened when my daughter-in-law Jessica's viral video reached my phone will restore your faith in karma and remind you that underestimating a quiet woman is the biggest mistake anyone can make. And trust me, you don't want to miss a single second of how I dismantled her perfect life piece by piece without her even knowing until it was far too late. I was sitting in my small bedroom at the back of my son David's house, the room they'd given me after I sold my own home to help them with their mortgage, when my phone buzzed with a notification, and I picked it up expecting maybe a message from my book club or a recipe from my sister Margaret, but instead it was a link sent by my neighbor Linda with the message, "You need to see this, I'm so sorry." And my hand started shaking before I even clicked it, because Linda's tone told me something was very wrong. And when the video loaded, I saw her, my daughter-in-law Jessica, sitting in what I recognized as their master bedroom, the one that used to be the guest room before they renovated, with money I'd given them. And she was doing her makeup, talking to her phone, propped up on the dresser, speaking to what the counter told me was nearly 200,000 followers. And I watched as she blended her foundation perfectly, talking about her morning routine, about her life as a busy mom and entrepreneur. And then she laughed, this light, casual laugh, and said, "You know what's funny? People always ask me how I manage everything with 2 kids and a business. And I tell them honestly, it's because I don't have dead weight around. And my mother-in-law, she just sits on her behind all day in that back room doing nothing, expecting us to wait on her hand and foot. And I swear sometimes I wonder why we even let her stay here." And the comments started flooding in, people laughing, people agreeing, people saying they had the same problem with their in-laws. And Jessica just kept talking, kept applying her mascara like she hadn't just humiliated me in front of hundreds of thousands of strangers. And I sat there on my bed in that back room, the room I paid for, in the house I helped save, watching my daughter-in-law call me worthless. And I felt something inside me crack, not break, because I'm not fragile. I'm 72 years old, and I've survived things that would destroy people half my age. But something shifted, something hardened, and I made a decision right there that Jessica was going to learn exactly who she was dealing with. But I had to be smart, had to be strategic, because going in angry would accomplish nothing. So I saved the video, screen recorded it, backed it up in 3 different places, and then I started planning. And the first thing I did was nothing, absolutely nothing. I continued my routine, waking up at 5:30 every morning like I always did, going to my room where I had my laptop and my files and my projects spread across the desk. Jessica had never once asked what I did in here, never showed the slightest curiosity about how I spent my days. She assumed, like she said in her video, that I just sat around being a burden, and that assumption was going to be her downfall. Because what Jessica didn't know was that I wasn't retired from life. I was retired from my job as a senior accountant at one of the largest firms in the state. And I'd spent 40 years managing money, building portfolios, understanding investments. And when I sold my house 3 years ago to help David and Jessica, I didn't give them all the money. I kept a substantial amount invested, carefully, and I'd been working remotely as a consultant for several high-net-worth clients, managing their finances from my laptop in that back room. And Jessica thought I was playing solitaire, when actually I was moving millions of dollars and making decisions that affected entire companies. And beyond that, I'd been quietly handling something else, something David had confided in me 2 years ago when their finances started falling apart. because Jessica's online boutique wasn't making money. It was losing it, hemorrhaging cash, on inventory that didn't sell, on advertising that didn't convert, on her luxury lifestyle that she documented online, making it seem like they were thriving when actually they were drowning in debt. And David was too proud to tell her to stop, too conflict-averse to stand up to his wife. So he'd come to me late one night after Jessica went to bed, and he'd broken down crying, telling me they were 3 months behind the mortgage, that they had $70,000 in credit card debt, that the bank was threatening foreclosure. And he'd begged me to help him figure out a way to save their house without Jessica knowing, because he didn't want her to feel like a failure, didn't want to damage her confidence. And I'd looked at my son, this man I'd raised to be strong and independent, and I saw how beaten down he was, how exhausted, and I'd made him a promise that I would fix it, and I did. I took over their finances quietly in the background. I consolidated their debts, negotiated with creditors, set up payment plans, sold some of my investments to cover their most urgent bills, and I created a budget that would get them back on track within 5 years. But it required sacrifice, required cutting back on the luxury purchases, the expensive dinners, the designer clothes that Jessica loved. And David was supposed to talk to her about it, supposed to explain that they needed to tighten their belts for a while. But he never did. He was too afraid of her, too afraid of being the bad guy. So Jessica kept spending, kept posting her perfect life online, kept building her brand on credit cards and loans, while I worked behind the scenes to keep them from losing everything. And she called me lazy, called me dead weight, while I was literally saving her, and she had no idea. And after I saw that video, I realized David needed to know what his wife really bought, needed to see who she really was. But I also knew I couldn't just show him the video, because he'd make excuses for her, would say she was stressed or didn't mean it or was just venting. So I needed to do something bigger, something that would make the truth undeniable. And that's when I started the second phase of my plan, which was documentation, but not the way you think. Because I wasn't interested in posting my own video or getting into a public fight. I had something much more effective in mind. So I started keeping records of everything, every dollar Jessica spent. And I had access to their accounts because I was managing their finances. Every purchase, every luxury item, every expensive brunch she Instagrammed while claiming they were building wealth. And I created a detailed spreadsheet showing the reality behind the facade. And then I did something else. I started reaching out to people in Jessica's circle, her followers, her friends, the brands she worked with. And I started asking questions, casual, innocent questions, about collaborations, about sponsorships, about whether the numbers she claimed were real. And what I discovered was even worse than I thought. Because Jessica had been lying about everything. Her follower count was largely fake, bots that inflated her numbers. The engagement on her posts was artificial. Her boutique sales were almost non-existent, and the lifestyle she portrayed was completely fraudulent. And some of the brands she claimed to work with had never even heard of her. And I documented all of it, every lie, every exaggeration, every fraud. And then I waited. And then 2 weeks after I saw that video, Jessica made another one. And this time, it was worse. She was doing a house tour, showing off their renovated kitchen, the one I'd paid for, with money from my house sale. And she told her followers that she'd saved for years to afford this renovation, that it was the result of her hard work and business success. And she walked past my closed bedroom door and whispered to the camera, "That's where my mill lives back there, in her little cave. She never comes out, never contributes, just exists and expects us to wait on her hand and foot." And I sat there on my bed, in that back room, the room I paid for, in the house I helped save, watching my daughter-in-law call me worthless. And I felt something inside me crack, not break, because I'm not fragile. I'm 72 years old, and I've survived things that would destroy people half my age. But something shifted, something hardened, and I made a decision right there that Jessica was going to learn exactly who she was dealing with. But I had to be smart, had to be strategic, because going in angry would accomplish nothing. So I saved the video, screen recorded it, backed it up in 3 different places, and then I started planning. And the first thing I did was nothing, absolutely nothing. I continued my routine, waking up at 5:30 every morning like I always did, going to my room where I had my laptop and my files and my projects spread across the desk. Jessica had never once asked what I did in here, never showed the slightest curiosity about how I spent my days. She assumed, like she said in her video, that I just sat around being a burden, and that assumption was going to her downfall. Because what Jessica didn't know was that I wasn't retired from life. I was retired from my job as a senior accountant at one of the largest firms in the state. And I'd spent 40 years managing money, building portfolios, understanding investments. And when I sold my house 3 years, I watched that second video 3 times, feeling my jaw clench tighter with each viewing, and I knew it was time to act, but I still needed one more piece of the puzzle, and that piece came from an unexpected source, which was my grandson Tyler, who was 7 years old and sharper than anyone gave him credit for, and he'd started coming to my room after school, hanging out with me while Jessica filmed content or worked on her boutique. And one day, he climbed up on my bed and said, "Grandma, why does Mom say mean things about you on her videos?" And my heart stopped, and I asked him what he meant. And he said, "I heard her telling her friend that you're old and useless, and that she wishes you'd move out so she could turn your room into a home gym." And I felt tears prick my eyes, not because her words hurt me, I was beyond that, but because my grandson had heard them, had been carrying this around thinking his grandmother was unwanted. And I hugged him close and told him that grown-ups sometimes say things they don't mean when they're stressed. And he looked at me with those big brown eyes, so much like David's, and said, "But Grandma, you're not useless. You help me with homework and you make the best cookies, and you're always nice to everyone." And that moment right there sealed Jessica's fate. Because she could insult me, she could mock me, she could call me lazy and worthless, but involving my grandson, making him feel confused and uncomfortable in his own home, crossed a line I couldn't forgive. So I went to David that evening after Jessica had gone to bed, and I told him we needed to talk, and I showed him everything. The videos, the comments, the financial records showing how much money I'd put into their house, how much I'd paid to save them from foreclosure, the documentation of Jessica's fraudulent online presence, and the spreadsheet showing that her business had never made a profit, had actually cost them tens of thousands of dollars. And I watched my son's face go through a journey of emotions, confusion, then disbelief, then horror, then anger. And he said, "Mom, why didn't you tell me you were doing all this?" And I said, "Because you asked me to, because you were drowning and you needed help, and I gave it freely without expecting thanks or recognition, but I did expect respect, and your wife has shown me none." And then I played him the videos, and I watched his face crumble as he heard the woman he loved, the mother of his children, talk about his mother like she was garbage, like she was a burden, when actually she was the only thing keeping their lives from falling apart. And David sat there on my bed in that back room with his head in his hands, and he said, "What do I do, Mom? How do I fix this?" And I told him the truth, which was that he couldn't fix it, that Jessica had shown who she really was, and now he had to decide if that was someone he wanted to be married to, someone who would mock an elderly woman who'd sacrificed everything to help them, someone who would lie to thousands of people about her success while secretly drowning in debt. And David sat there on my bed in that back room with his head in his hands, and he said, "What do I do, Mom? How do I fix this?" And I told him the truth, which was that he couldn't fix it, that Jessica had shown who she really was, and now he had to decide if that was someone he wanted to be married to, someone who would mock an elderly woman who'd sacrificed everything to help them, someone who would lie to thousands of people about her success while secretly drowning in debt. And David sat there on my bed in that back room with his head in his hands, and he said, "What do I do, Mom? How do I fix this?" And I told him the truth, which was that he couldn't fix it, that Jessica had shown who she really was, and now he had to decide if that was someone he wanted to be married to, someone who would mock an elderly woman who'd sacrificed everything to help them, someone who cared more about appearances than reality. And David spent 3 days thinking about it, 3 days during which he barely spoke to Jessica. And she noticed, of course. She cornered him in the kitchen one morning and demanded to know what was wrong. And he told her they needed to have a serious conversation about finances, about her spending, about the future of their marriage. And Jessica laughed, actually laughed, and said, "We're fine. Stop being so dramatic. I've got everything under control." And David said, "No, you don't. Mom's had everything under control. She's been saving us for 2 years while you spent money we didn't have." And Jessica's face went pale, and she said, "What are you talking about?" And that's when David told her everything, told her about the debt, the near foreclosure, the money I'd contributed, the budget I'd created. And Jessica's expression shifted from shock to anger. And she said, "Your mother has been managing our money without my knowledge." And David said, "No, I asked her to, because we were going to lose the house and you wouldn't stop spending." And Jessica's face flushed red, and she said, "This is unbelievable. Your mother is manipulating you, turning you against me." And David pulled out his phone and played the first video, the one where she'd called me lazy and worthless. And Jessica watched it, and I saw something flicker across her face. Recognition, maybe, or calculation. And she said, "I was joking. It's just content. People don't take that stuff seriously." And David said, "Our son takes it seriously. He asked Grandma why you say mean things about her." And Jessica's face went white, and she said, "Tyler heard that." And David nodded and said, "How do you think that makes him feel? How do you think it makes Mom feel?" And Jessica's anger returned full force, and she said, "If your mother has a problem with me, she can say it to my face instead of running to you like a child." And I chose that moment to walk into the kitchen, and I said, "I'm saying it to your face now, Jessica. You've spent 3 years living in this house that I helped pay for, eating food that my money bought, wearing clothes purchased with credit cards that I'm helping pay off. And you've never once said thank you, never once shown an ounce of gratitude. Instead, you've mocked me online, called me lazy and worthless, while I worked behind the scenes to save you from your own financial incompetence." And the room went silent. You could have heard a pin drop. And Jessica stared at me like she'd never seen me before. And she said, "How dare you call me incompetent?" And I smiled and said, "I'm not calling you incompetent, Jessica. I'm stating a fact. Your business has never made a profit, your follower count is largely fake, your brand deals are non-existent, and your spending has put this family on the brink of ruin." And Jessica's face cycled through several emotions: shock, denial, anger, fear. And she said, "You've been spying on me." And I said, "No, I've been managing the accounts your husband gave me access to, because someone had to be the adult in this situation." And Jessica turned to David and said, "Are you going to let her talk to me like this?" And David said, "Mom's right, Jessica. Everything she's saying is true. And I think you need to leave." And Jessica laughed, a sharp, bitter sound, and said, "Leave? This is my house." And David said, "Actually, it's the bank's house. And the only reason we still live here is because Mom saved us. So yes, you need to leave. You need to go stay with your parents or a friend and figure out what kind of person you want to be." And Jessica's face contorted, and she said, "I'm not going anywhere." And that's when I played my final card, because I'd been saving this moment, orchestrating it carefully. And I said, "Jessica, you have 2 choices. You can leave voluntarily, and we can work out a separation quietly, privately. Or I can release a video of my own, showing your real financial situation, your fake followers, your fraudulent brand, the reality behind your perfect online life, and I can include the videos where you mocked me, and let your hundreds of thousands of followers decide what they think about a woman who humiliates the elderly woman who saved her from homelessness." The color drained from Jessica's face as she realized I wasn't bluffing, and she said, "You wouldn't do that." And I said, "Try me, Jessica. I've spent 40 years in finance dealing with people much smarter and much more ruthless than you, and I have no problem exposing the truth." And something in my voice must have convinced her, because she grabbed her phone and her purse and said, "Fine, I'll go, but this isn't over." And she stormed out of the house, and I heard her car peel out of the driveway, and David collapsed into a chair and said, "Mom, what have we done?" And I said, "We've told the truth, sweetheart, that's all." And the next few days were chaos. Jessica did go to her parents' house, and apparently she told them her version of events, painted me as a controlling, manipulative monster who turned her husband against her. And her mother actually called me, demanding to know how I could treat her daughter so cruelly. And I very calmly told her that her daughter had publicly humiliated me, had lied about her financial success, and had been living off money I'd provided while calling me worthless. And I offered to send her the videos and the financial records. And Jessica's mother went quiet and said, "I'll call you back." And she did call back 3 hours later, and her tone was completely different. And she said, "I had no idea. I'm so sorry. Jessica told us you were being unreasonable, but I see now that she's been lying to everyone." And I said, "Yes, she has, and now she needs to face the consequences of that." And Jessica's mother said, "What do you want from her?" And I said, "I want her to take down the videos where she mocked me. I want her to be honest with her followers about her real financial situation. And I want her to apologize to my grandson for making him feel uncomfortable in his own home." And there was a long pause, and Jessica's mother said, "I'll talk to her." And 2 days later, Jessica posted a new video, and I watched it with David and Tyler sitting next to me. And in the video, Jessica looked different. No perfect makeup, no carefully styled hair, just a woman in a plain t-shirt with red-rimmed eyes. And she said, "I need to be honest with you guys. I've been lying about a lot of things. My business hasn't been as successful as I've made it seem. My lifestyle hasn't been as luxurious as I've portrayed. And I've been living beyond my means for a long time. And worst of all, I said some really cruel things about my mother-in-law, who's actually been helping my family in ways I didn't even know about. And I'm ashamed of that. I'm ashamed of prioritizing appearances over reality, and I'm taking a break from social media to figure out who I really am and what really matters." And then the video ended, and I looked at David, and he had tears running down his face, and he said, "Do you think she means it?" And I said, "I think she's scared, and sometimes fear is the beginning of change." And over the next few weeks, things slowly shifted. Jessica stayed with her parents and started therapy, started dealing with the issues that had driven her to create such an elaborate facade. And David and I talked, really talked for the first time in years about his marriage, about his fears, about why he'd enabled Jessica's behavior for so long. And he admitted that he'd been afraid of losing her, afraid that if he stood up to her, she'd leave. And I told him that a relationship built on fear isn't a relationship worth having. And Tyler, in all of this, Tyler was the surprising source of strength, because he said to his father one day, "Dad, I think Mom needs to learn to be happy with what she has instead of always wanting more." And David stared at his 7-year-old son and said, "When did you get so wise?" And Tyler shrugged and said, "Grandma taught me." And my heart swelled, because that's what this was really about. It wasn't about revenge or vindication. It was about teaching lessons about dignity and honesty and the importance of gratitude. And after 2 months, Jessica came back, not to move back in, but to talk. And she sat in our living room, the one I'd helped furnish, and she looked at me and said, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what I said. I'm sorry for how I treated you. I'm sorry for taking everything you did for granted." And I saw real remorse in her eyes, real understanding. And I said, "Jessica, I forgive you. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means I'm choosing not to let your actions poison me anymore. But you have a long way to rebuild trust." And she nodded and said, "I know, and I'm willing to do the work." And slowly, painfully, she did do the work. She got a regular job, quit trying to be an influencer, stopped living for likes and comments, and started living for real things like time with her children and honest conversations with her husband. And David and Jessica eventually reconciled, but it was different now. It was based on truth instead of illusions. And Jessica never forgot the lesson she'd learned, which was that the quiet people, the ones you dismiss as weak or useless, are often the ones holding everything together. And as for me, I eventually moved out, not because anyone asked me to, but because I wanted my own space again, wanted to live on my own terms. And I bought a small condo near the beach, used the money I'd carefully invested and saved, and I visited Tyler and David regularly. And even Jessica and I developed a cordial relationship. Not warm exactly, but respectful. And one day, about a year after everything happened, Jessica came to visit me at my condo, and she brought flowers and a card, and she said, "I never thanked you properly for saving us." And I said, "You're thanking me now." And she said, "No, I mean really thanked you. You could have let us fail, could have watched us lose everything, and instead, you sacrificed your own comfort, your own money to help us. And then, when I treated you terribly, you still gave me a chance to make it right. And that's more grace than I deserved." And I looked at this woman who'd once called me worthless, and I saw something different in her now, something humbler, something real. And I said, "Jessica, we all make mistakes. What matters is what we do after we're caught, whether we double down on the lies or whether we choose to grow." And she nodded and said, "I'm choosing to grow." And as she left, I thought about the journey we'd all been on, about how sometimes the biggest revenge isn't destroying someone, it's giving them the mirror they need to see themselves clearly, and forcing them to choose who they want to be. And Jessica had looked in that mirror, and she'd chosen to be better. And Tyler, my beautiful grandson, came to visit me every weekend, and he'd curl up next to me on my couch and say, "Grandma, tell me again about how you taught Mom to be nice." And I'd laugh and say, "I didn't teach her to be nice. I taught her about consequences, about truth." And he'd nod very seriously and say, "When I grow up, I want to be strong like you." And I'd hug him close and say, "You already are, sweetheart. You already are." And that's the real ending to this story, not with destruction or bitterness, but with growth and understanding and the knowledge that sometimes the greatest power comes not from tearing someone down, but holding up a mirror and letting them see themselves for who they really are and giving them the choice.